Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, everyone. A couple of things. One is I'm getting over a cold, or I'm getting a cold, or getting over, I'm not quite sure. So I apologize if I cough. I'll try to do that away from the microphone. And the second thing is I'm actually in a storage room at Education Development Center where I work because I've traveled so much I gave up my office, and there's a party that will be happening at 1 o'clock. So at some point I have to turn off my camera because people will be coming in to remove boxes and furniture that are behind me. So thanks for joining, and as Tiana said, the webinar today is teacher motivation and demotivation. It's hard to talk about one without the other. What it is, why we should care, and how we begin to address it. So I haven't seen, I was trying to make this a little bit interactive and see if anybody would put forth a definition of motivation. So I'll actually just go ahead and get started on this. So this webinar is really organized around 4 questions. So the first, is what do we mean by teacher motivation and by extension teacher demotivation? They're really coupled. Second is why should we care about teacher motivation? Third is what are some of the factors that contribute to teacher motivation? And who is addressing issues around teacher motivation globally? So sort of what, why, and who sorts of questions. So question 1, what do we mean by teacher motivation? So very simply, motivation is the reason why people decide to do something, and how long people are willing to do it, and how hard they're going to work to pursue the goals associated with that activity. So motivation is a really very broad term, a very term with lots of multiple parts to it. So it can include anything such as teachers' job satisfaction, their sense of agency and well-being, their sense of professionalism, their degree of self-efficacy, that is their belief that they have the requisite skills to teach children well, their feelings of worth, their feelings of being valued, their willingness to comply with all professional requirements, their receptivity to reforms and innovation. It's sort of a state of satisfaction or happiness doing an activity that involves high levels of concentration, immersion, strength, what we sometimes refer to as flow. So teacher motivation is one or many of these things, and teacher demotivation is the absence of one or many of these things. I'm limited by PowerPoint, but motivation isn't one thing. It's really sort of a range of beliefs, dispositions, and behaviors, and oftentimes it's, from what I've found looking at the research, it's really organized along axes. So there's intrinsic motivation. Teachers actually tend to be generally have very high levels of intrinsic motivation, and it's usually around wanting to work with children and young adults. And that can range from intrinsic to extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is external motivators, things like high social status or money. And it's also important to think of motivation as being sort of initiating why people begin an action, the reasons for doing something, and sustaining. So why people tend to persist in a particular activity. So when we're talking about motivation, we're actually talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, and we're talking about why people get into teaching in the first place, and then why they stay with it, why they sustain it. So a second question is really, why should we care about teacher motivation? And I'm actually going to ask you all to take a minute and just know why is it important? Why should we care about teacher motivation? Because this is not necessarily something that many folks, policymakers, program designers actually care about. So let's take a minute and see what some of your responses are. So we've got from Claudia, it's important to consider teacher motivation because in order to avoid teacher burnout, in order to sustain teaching. Patricia, in order to sustain teaching. Anyone else?
As we had an earlier response by Saida Ponte, she said, motivation is a state that could include manners, ways of teaching, and inclusion of
Mm-hmm.
technology for all students.
Mm-hmm. So, Andrea, teacher is the heart of the school in order to ensure quality teaching. Yeah, there's some great answers here. We'll take about another minute. Yep, so teachers continue to show up in spite of low salaries or no salaries at all. A motivated individual motivates others, so you sort of have a critical mass of motivation. Good. These are all great responses. Essentially, why should we care about teacher motivation? Actually, let me come back for a second. I'm going to answer that question generally and then specifically. So generally speaking, in every country where the OAS, where Ayten and Riyad work, elementary and secondary education is mandatory. And so that means that our children and our young adults actually spend a significant portion of their day in the legal care of teachers. And as we know, and I'll discuss later on, we all know this, of course, that the quality of teaching is the biggest influencer, school-based influencer in terms of student achievement. But also, teacher salaries are actually, in many countries, the biggest input, in most countries actually, they're the biggest input in an education budget, usually averaging around 20%. So having said that, as people who know about motivation much better than I do will be able to tell you, the research on motivation is pretty, it's often conflicting and varied. So these are data from UNESCO in Santiago, and this is data from Latin America that shows that teachers across the region, these purple lines, generally have very high levels of motivation. And however, we can see that in and of itself, teacher motivation and teacher satisfaction with teaching doesn't necessarily or uniformly correlate with higher achievement scores for students. So these are math scores for 3rd and 6th graders, and you can see the dots essentially show that even though teachers have high satisfaction levels in Latin America, this doesn't necessarily translate into high test scores. So, motivation is important, but it's extremely important, but it's not the be-all, end-all. It's often not enough. So, specifically, though, I asked why should we care about teacher motivation, and we should really care about teacher motivation from multiple perspectives. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about these, and these are policy perspectives, programmatic perspectives, organizational perspectives, that is the school, and instructional perspectives and individual perspectives. So I'll go through these very quickly. So first of all, we all know this, globally we're facing a huge shortage in teachers. So UNESCO's Institute for Statistics tells us that by 2030 we will have a shortage of anywhere from 23 to 26 million teachers globally. And this obviously varies according to continent, it varies according to region, whether it's urban or rural. But beyond the teacher shortage, we actually have shortages in our current supply of teachers and how we develop teachers, our current supply. So for example, I tried to illustrate this with this funnel. So this is data from the United States. So of the people who study teaching at a bachelor level, about 50% of those who graduate with a teaching degree never end up teaching. And if you look at the next level here, entering teaching, of the people who do enter teaching over the course of 5 years, this is based on US data, about 40 to 50% of those folks will actually leave teaching. And then we see in the United States, again, that annually about 8% of teachers actually retire. So teacher motivation is extraordinarily important from this policy perspective because A, we need teachers. So we have to motivate people to initiate a career in teaching. And B, motivated teachers are much more likely to stay teaching. They're less likely to be absent or leave the teaching profession, and they're more likely to teach well. So motivated teachers, from a purely financial perspective, save districts and provinces and states and countries money. So demotivated teachers, in contrast, who leave the profession, who are frequently absent, which is its own form of attrition, or who are derelict in their duties, actually impose substantial costs in terms of recruitment and retaining, in terms of disciplinary costs for poor or unethical performance, and in terms of costs associated with absenteeism or teacher shortages, especially in very important economically related content areas like STEM. Excuse me. So motivation there's a second perspective. It's very important for education reform. So we know from research that motivated teachers are much more likely to embrace and enact specific educational reforms. They're much more likely to generally support educational reform. So from an implementation perspective, intrinsically motivated teachers undertake and they complete professional tasks. So they transfer what they've learned from professional development, for example, to the classroom. And they do this not out of a sense of compliance, but really out of a sense of commitment, because they believe in the inherent value of the learning that they are transferring. So in addition to implementing reform and new practices from formal professional development, teacher motivation is also related to general teacher improvement. So very broadly speaking, we know that motivated teachers are much more likely to focus on new ideas, devote more time to learning tasks, be more likely to remember and retain new information, and generally want to improve their craft. A third important perspective on motivation, a third reason why motivation matters, is it really matters organizationally. Essentially, teacher motivation impacts making schools good places for adults and for children. So for example, motivation and job satisfaction are really highly correlated with autonomy, which provides teachers with the freedom to accomplish certain tasks. And motivation and job satisfaction are connected to collegiality. And so collegiality is directly linked to effective schools and good schools, because there are organizations in which teachers are valued and they're allowed to participate in continuous school improvement. Motivation and job satisfaction are connected to collaboration, and collaboration can really only occur when teachers experience challenging and stimulating work, and when they have the autonomy and are given a group of colleagues with whom they can engage in school improvement, such as developing curriculum or writing strategic plans. And so all of these factors that arise from motivation, autonomy and collegiality and collaboration, and which almost auto-correlate with motivation, really improve the social capital of the school. And social capital are just networks of relationships that enable an institution to function successfully. So motivation is extremely important, as we all know, from a classroom perspective, that is, from an instructional perspective. So low teacher motivation results in absenteeism and underutilization of instructional time, professional misconduct, reliance on traditional teaching practices, poor preparation, and secondary income generation activities, which either often result in the teacher being absent from class, or the teacher being so tired that he or she can't function properly in class, or that off the second income generation activities often result in teachers not having time to plan and prepare for class. And high teacher motivation, in contrast, is really connected to greater teacher efficacy. And teacher efficacy, a belief that a teacher feels that she knows how to teach students well, is very highly connected to student efficacy, a belief on the part of students that they know how to learn, that they can learn. And high teacher efficacy is connected to high student achievement. So we know from research that more motivated teachers tend to focus on a mastery approach to teaching. So in other words, they want students to have real deep content knowledge, and they focus on techniques and strategies to help students constantly improve their performance. And we also know that more motivated teachers are more likely to engage in what we call academic press. So this idea, academic press is really this idea that teachers push students to higher levels of achievement. They work them hard, essentially. So teachers who use academic press really challenge students to go beyond current levels of learning and really challenge them to put forth a full effort. And finally, I would argue that motivation is important in and of itself for individual reasons. We want happy and satisfied and motivated employees, and teacher well-being is both a cause and effect of teacher motivation, but it's also intrinsically desirable outcome in and of itself. So what are some of the factors that contribute to teacher motivation, or by contrast, teacher demotivation? So at this point, my colleagues are at the door, so I'm going to quickly turn up my video camera, if I can see it, for one moment, and then I'm going to turn you back on again. So what are some factors that contribute to teacher demotivation? So there's actually quite a lot of factors, and we will look at 6 of them. So I'll go through each one individually, but you can see here culture and mission, merit pay and pay, work context, work content, occupational status, teacher characteristics. So in terms of culture and mission, there are cultural issues around perceptions of teaching that really influence teacher motivation. So, for instance, teacher motivation and job satisfaction in many East Asian countries, I've just returned from East Asia actually, is said to be quite high. East Asian cultures tend to attach great importance to education and great respect for teachers. This does not mean, however, that some of these countries that I'll be talking about in a second are actually without problems in terms of their teaching force, or that they don't face shortages in teachers. So, excuse me, in China, teachers rank pretty high in surveys of occupational prestige. But teachers' salaries tend to be low in China relative to other occupations. So China actually, even though this is a high prestige profession, they actually have a lot of teacher shortages, especially in rural areas. And prestige is quite high in some areas of China. In some areas more than others, like Shanghai and Beijing, where the government has allowed a certain amount of flexibility in experimentation. And these are especially Shanghai areas that have been noted for excellence. So in Korea, South Korea, teaching is a relatively sought-after occupation because of its job security and its high social standing. So very competitive individuals will often aspire to enter teaching, and the rate of turnover is very, very low because salaries are high, and because most teachers remain in teaching until they retire, and because teaching education is so valued by Korean society. In Japan, teaching is a very attractive option for college students. It's well paid, it enjoys respect, a high degree of job autonomy. And if you know anything about Japanese schools, you know that Japanese schools are noted internationally for having highly collaborative cultures, which is very supportive environments. So turnover and attrition rates, that is dropout rates in Japan, are quite low. The star of, I'm not there yet, sorry. In Hong Kong, teaching is very high in terms of occupational status, and its pay is quite good. What's interesting about Hong Kong is the quality of new entrants to teaching is actually become a matter of concern because the occupation isn't attracting candidates with the highest academic achievement as it is in other fields such as engineering or sciences. The country that seems to do the best in terms of teacher motivation, teacher retention, teacher policies, etc., is Singapore. In Singapore, teaching is very high prestige. It's very, very high paying. Education has long been a key government priority, and teachers in Singapore really actually occupy this sort of high strategic national importance. So in these East Asian cultures, we see that generally speaking, teaching is very high status, it's very well respected, it tends to be well paid in most places. China is an exception because it's so vast and has so many different regions. And if you think about this, these are, you can contrast this with other places like that we might know in our work, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, certainly parts of the United States, where education in general is not, it doesn't occupy the place it does in East Asian cultures. It tends to be much more low paying, and we tend to be societies that attach more to individual ambitions versus kind of service or group oriented focus of teaching. Excuse me. A second factor in terms of motivation or demotivation is merit pay. I haven't talked about pay, though I'll talk about that in a second, but I want to focus on merit pay because merit pay, certainly in the United States, has been proposed as a way to actually both improve teacher motivation and to get more people into teaching. So merit pay essentially is providing some kind of competitive compensation and a variety of incentives for achieving excellence and meeting goals. And so the research on merit pay is quite mixed. It shows that in some contexts, the provision of monetary incentives can be effective devices to discourage absenteeism. In the United States, for example, or in other places, merit pay has been shown, such as the United States, there was a large-scale study done, excuse me, has been shown actually to be somewhat demotivating. Teachers report that they actually feel like they're now competing with their colleagues instead of collaborating with them. There's research from East Africa, from Kenya, for example, that shows that, and Kenya and actually West Africa is from Liberia as well, that shows that teachers may respond better to non-monetary incentives like professional development, which is something you suggested in your chat, Andrea, and to monitoring and support. So in Chile, merit pay was tried several years ago, and it was found to fail achieving long-term improvements in student learning, and it just encouraged teachers to boost students' short-term performance in order to meet targets with which the incentives are tied up. So there's a strong history that shows that there's a lot of conflict around whether merit pay works or not, but what a lot of the research or proponents of the research that I've seen shows is that it often encourages teachers to try to meet these short-term goals in and of themselves and then abandon whatever they're doing because they've received their bonus pay or their merit pay and the goals have been met. I specifically didn't want to get into teacher salary because that could be a webinar in and of itself. So there's a lot of dispute around whether money is a motivator to teachers or not, and a lot of the research that I've seen suggests that teachers enter teaching not because they're motivated by salary, but when they leave teaching, salary is often one of the reasons why. Essentially, people need to earn a certain level. You need a good salary. You need to be able to survive doing your job. There's some argument that teachers who aren't satisfied with salary actually do poorly in class. But again, this is data from Latin America, from UNESCO, because it tends to show that teacher satisfaction with salary is linked to student achievement. So in 12 of the education systems that are profiled here, we can see statistically significant higher math scores for students whose teachers are satisfied with their salaries. But these are data, when the webinar is made available, you'll be able to see these data more closely. There's a lot going on in these slides, and I've also included in the top left-hand corner the resource that you can look at. But we see that in Argentina and Peru and Uruguay, there are many teachers who are not satisfied with their salaries, but their students still obtain high math scores. So the argument about teacher salary and student achievement there's really no consistency to it. But the notion of teacher salary, teachers entering teaching and staying in teaching because of salary is extremely important. So there's a third set of factors, which are work context factors. So work context factors are those factors that meet teachers' baseline needs. So they include working conditions such as class size, discipline conditions, the availability of teaching materials, the quality of principal supervision, and basic psychological needs: money, status, the nature of their contracts, the nature, whether they're permanent or temporary, the distance to the workplace, the quality of school facilities, the existence of systems to monitor teachers' work, attendance, etc., teacher safety and security. So if there's enough of these factors, this idea of, enough resources, safety and security, status, etc., the research shows that they do prevent demotivation. However, even the most intrinsically motivated teacher is going to become discouraged if the salary that he or she earns does not pay the mortgage. There is research suggesting that many of these work context factors may not have an extended motivational effect, and that they might have little relationship to long-term satisfaction with teaching as a career. So a fourth set of factors that impacts teacher motivation or demotivation are what are called work content factors. So these are factors that are sort of intrinsic to teaching itself. So they include opportunities for professional development, recognition, challenging and varied work, increased responsibility, achievement, empowerment, authority. They also include teachers assigned to teach subjects that match or may not match their fields of preparation. And there's quite a bit of data around this cluster of motivational factors from the United States, showing that many of these work content factors do influence motivation, that staff recognition and parental support and teacher participation in school decision making and influence over school policy and control in the classroom are the factors most strongly associated with teacher satisfaction. And there's other research showing that most teachers need to have some kind of sense of accomplishment in these sectors if they're to persevere and excel in the difficult work of teaching. In one regard, one piece of information that I'd like to share in terms of this cluster of factors is this idea of emergency teachers. So there's, in many states in the United States, for example, in many places, there's been heavy recruitment of mid-career professionals or emergency teachers, encouraging professionals to come into the teaching profession, giving them some kind of baseline training and then allowing them to teach students. And the research shows that if teachers are even if they're highly motivated, if they're actually teaching outside their subject area specialty, if they're, for example, me, I taught Latin for years, although I never took a Latin course, that this actually can be a factor that leads to demotivation, because as you are teaching outside your area of expertise, you begin to realize what you don't know and the limits you have in terms of helping students learn content, and that in itself is a demotivating factor. Excuse me. Another area, I think this is actually the fifth area, is occupational status. So occupational status is the degree to which the public values competence and the role and the overall contribution of a particular occupation in terms of individual and societal welfare. So occupations with high status, high professional status, usually have high levels of education and training attached to them. They have a strong ideal of service or public service with an enforced professional code of conduct, and they have high levels of respect from the public at large. So I talked about high occupational status in East Asian cultures, for example, around teaching. And this is an area where I mentioned these are factors that influence teacher motivation. High occupational status is, in most of the world, is probably a factor that influences teacher demotivation, because teaching in many countries doesn't have high occupational status. Teachers in a lot of countries, I would argue in many places in the United States, are really considered semi-professionals because of their relatively low levels of education and training vis-a-vis other occupations like engineering or medicine. the sheer size of the teaching force really militates against this professional exclusivity and teaching. So teaching is the sort of profession where you can choose it at any point in your career, unlike things like medicine or engineering that have much more rigorous standards, and they're sort of professions that choose you. So among those who study work, however, and organizations and occupations, teaching has traditionally been classified as very complex work, and any of us who've been teachers could certainly echo that sentiment. And teaching is characterized by uncertainty and intangibility and ambiguity, and it requires high degrees of initiative and thought and judgment and skill to do really well. I like to argue that teaching, you don't just impart information, you're a policeman, you're a social worker, you're a counselor. It requires so many different roles. But however, despite the complexity of it, teaching is perceived as, in many parts of the globe, as a really easy entry occupation, and often then is employment of the last resort among university graduates or secondary school leavers in many countries. And then this is compounded by its low pay, especially vis-a-vis other professions, and by the actual difficulty of being a teacher. And so these factors around, these considerations around occupational status often result in teachers lacking this very strong long-term commitment to teaching as a vocation. Teacher motivation actually also differs by teacher characteristics. So for example, it differs by gender. The research in the United States, again, I apologize for all the research in the United States, but that's where a lot of the research is, shows that male teachers generally feel higher levels of job satisfaction and motivation than female teachers. They report being happier, enjoying what they do more, are more interested in what they're doing, and have less of a desire to be doing something else, more so than female teachers. And on the other hand, women give themselves higher scores. Female teachers give themselves higher scores for levels of success and skill. So teaching motivation can differ by gender, but it also differs by experience. So essentially, if you can get through the first several years of teaching and learning how to be a teacher, motivation levels increase. So increased lengths of service are correlated, teaching service are correlated with greater satisfaction with salary, with higher levels of self-esteem, with higher levels of respect for the teaching profession, and decreased levels of stress. And finally, and this should come as no surprise, but teacher motivation is influenced by students to a very high degree. So there's overwhelming research, as I mentioned earlier, that teachers everywhere across the globe enter teaching in order to help young people learn, and that their most gratifying reward is accomplishing this goal, and that the work-related factors most important to teachers are really those that allow them to teach well, to practice their craft successfully, and to do well with children. And where teachers feel they can motivate and influence student learning, for example in East Asia, where there's very high perceived motivation among students to do well academically, and where there's greater respect for teachers, there's higher teacher motivation. And where teachers feel they can't motivate and influence student learning, for example in many low-income contexts, there's lower teacher motivation. And essentially, data from the US shows that teachers who teach in schools with high-achieving students and or low discipline problems have much higher levels of motivation than teachers who teach in schools with very low student achievement or high discipline problems. So student behavior and student achievement and student characteristics influence teacher motivation. Excuse me, and I'm going to turn my camera back on because my last colleague has gone out the door. Camera. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. So we come to a fourth question, and that question is essentially who's addressing.
Remember to click on the start sharing my video.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. So who's addressing issues around teacher motivation? And there's a lot going on everywhere, really, around these issues around teacher motivation. The issue is that teacher motivation is such a broad and all-encompassing term that people are often, and institutions are often, addressing slices of it. But I'd like to mention several here. So, for example, in many countries, Ecuador is one, Finland, the Asian countries that I've mentioned, many of these countries have implemented different strategies to enhance the professionalism and increase the occupational status of teachers through more stringent licensing standards, through higher admission and academic criteria for teacher education programs, through more diverse alternative certification programs, through controlling the supply and initial training of teachers, as is done in Singapore. So, as an aside, I spent 6 months in Ecuador with the UNAI, which the acronym I used to remember, but it's the Universidad Nacional de Educación. So it was the Ecuadorian government's efforts, it's ongoing now, to create a national university through which all teacher training will occur, similar to the National Institute of Education in Singapore. Again, a lot of efforts by a lot of countries challenging career prospects and financial incentives for mid-career professionals to join teaching, retention benefits to encourage teachers to stay in the profession or to return to teaching after retirement. So there's a lot of loan forgiveness in the United States for people to teach and then to return to high-need schools. And in many Asian countries in which I work, government scholarships for PhDs and for master's degrees are often predicated on the individual returning and actually teaching in a university, or mostly teaching in a university, but teaching in a high school. But I wanted to mention a few institutions or organizations in particular. So one is the International Task Force on Teachers for Education. So this is the first dedicated international alliance of stakeholders, including national governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, international development agencies, private sector groups that are focused on the whole issue of having enough teachers for 2030, which is when when we're supposed to meet our sustainable development goals. So the International Task Force on Teachers for Education holds conferences. Several I-10 folks were there, as was I, in March 2016 in Mexico City, where we looked at everything from teacher salary to teacher labor conditions to professional development. The International Task Force on Teachers for Education has also been a big supporter of the second group that I want to mention, which is the Teacher Motivation Working Group. So this is the only group, I have an affiliation with this group, and this is where I've learned most of my formal information about teacher motivation. This is a cross-institutional international working group on teacher motivation. It studies all aspects of teacher motivation. It hosts webinars, a yearly workshop at CIS. It's developed a tool to measure teacher motivation and has a lot of initial data on the application of this tool and initial findings. It does and gathers research on all aspects of teacher motivation. So anyone who is interested in teacher motivation is welcome to join the Teacher Motivation Working Group, and the URL is right here. I want to specifically mention two groups, two organizations. They're not organizations, but governmental agencies that are doing a lot of work around teacher motivation, although I don't know if they would classify it as such. And two groups that I got to know through my involvement with RIED and I-10 as part of their horizontal cooperation missions. I'm sure many in the audience know that the OAS was hosting these horizontal cooperation missions where government agencies across the Americas would come and meet and share knowledge. And I was privileged to be part of two of these. And one you can see in the bottom part of the screen is the Ministry of Education for Colombia. So Specifically, Colombia's Secretarías de Educación Pública have a number of programs that address teacher well-being, in particular in areas that suffered through the 52-year war. So these initiatives focus on things like teacher health, teacher mental health, teacher well-being, helping teachers recover after the conflict, and helping teachers teach and participate in conflict resolution. And a second organization, a second group is Peru's Ministry of Education. And I'm not sure, do we have anyone here from the Peruvian Ministry of Education? We have somebody typing. So the Spanish version of this webinar will be held later this year in December, possibly early January, and we'll actually have a representative from the Ministry of Education. But Peru's Ministry of Education has done an enormous amount to address issues around teacher motivation and well-being. So they've, among other things, they were kind enough to send me a 4-page document about what they've done, so I can't mention everything, but they've developed a national policy on teacher welfare, university scholarships for children of teachers who show demonstrable excellence in the classroom, that is the teachers, guidelines for minimum educational infrastructure in schools so that teachers are able to develop teaching activities with ease, and temporary housing for teachers who work in rural schools. Sorry, that was a question. So let me conclude here because I see that there are a number of questions and my voice is about to go. And let's open it up for discussion. I'll just say very quickly that if you're interested in issues about teachers, just as not just teacher motivation, I don't publish a lot of my own thoughts on Twitter, but I actually circulate a lot of articles on Twitter around teacher quality, teacher motivation, teacher professional development, teacher recruiting, teacher pay. And I write a monthly blog post for the Global Partnership for Education, usually focused on teaching and teacher professional development. But aside from what I write for these folks, there's actually a wealth of information from other people who are much more specialized and knowledgeable than I am on all aspects of education, including teachers and teaching. So thank you, everyone. And we can, excuse me, open this up for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Mary, for this really interesting presentation, and of course for giving us the insight of your own experience around the world. And before I start with the questions that I have gathered from the chat box, I would like to start with something that it was in my mind while you were talking, and I would like to ask it from a very personal point of view. Which do you think are the most effective ways to encourage this and teacher motivation in countries like the ones that we have?
So, Diana, I'm losing you. I've lost your audio. Can you try the question again?
Yes, sure. So my question is, from your own experience working in the region, in the Americas, including Latin America and the Caribbean, which do you think are the most effective ways to promote teacher motivation from the perspective of the policymakers, from the perspective of the education community, including principals, and of course for the students and their families and their communities? And then this is my question, and then we'll continue with the ones that the teachers asked.
So, Diana, I've got the first part of the question, and I just lost what you just said now.
I'll continue with the questions that the other teachers asked during.
Okay, well, I'll start, and then I know we have, I'm looking at the names now for the first time. So we have Dan, we have Vladimir, we have Mary Mendenhall. So we have lots of folks here. Andrea, I don't know if he's still on. So we have a lot of people here who have lots of experience working with teachers around the globe. So I'm gonna start, and then I'm gonna let you guys jump in, I guess through the chat, or maybe through audio, because to share your experiences, and B, because I think I'm about to lose my voice. So yeah, that's a good question. In terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, I was a teacher in Latin America, and I was a teacher in the Caribbean as well, and I've worked with teachers in both places. And I think every place is unique and has its own set of unique conditions, and I think even within countries, there's a great deal of variation. I would say that salary is important. It matters. The highest salaries don't necessarily translate into greater student achievement. I mean, the United States is an example of that. So I live in Massachusetts, which we have the, our students, I've read various things, but essentially if we were our own country, we would be the highest, among the world's highest scorers in math and science, especially I think at the 8th grade level. But we don't have the highest salaries. But that said, being a teacher and teacher salary, making a good salary is important. It's critical. So I was one of those teachers that worked multiple jobs so that I could actually pay my rent, but it took a toll on my teaching. I think, respect for the profession. So I always say that being a teacher is like being the manager of the Boston Red Sox. Everyone thinks they know how to do their job better than you do. I guess because we've all been to school, so we all have ideas of what teachers and teaching should be. But oftentimes that translates into a lack of respect for teachers and, a tremendous amount of disrespect, an overt disrespect for teachers that people feel, they feel it. And it's hurtful. I would say teacher voice, oftentimes, most of the time, professional development is imposed on teachers, initiatives are imposed on teachers. So many things are done to teachers as opposed to with them. And, conditions, school conditions, everything from having enough resources and professional development to your students. So I taught in very high need schools, and I worked in very high need schools in Jamaica, and I worked in a very wealthy school in Jamaica, and there's no question about it. It's a lot easier to teach rich kids than it is to teach poor kids, because rich children have so many, their families can compensate and provide so much that poor families can't. So there's sets of challenges associated with both, but when there's issues around poverty and a lack of achievement, it can be particularly, and when you're getting no support, multiple levels of support, it can be particularly demotivating. So I think salary, respect, voice, and certainly school conditions. So that's a long answer, so let's hear what other people have said. Anyone else want to add to what I mentioned?
Mary,
Mm-hmm.
while we wait for the teachers to answer your question, let me just start with the questions that they asked during your presentation.
Sure.
So we had a question by Patricia Faustina that I would like to reformulate, but it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
She was saying that you were talking that highly motivated teachers that not always highly motivated teachers result in highly motivated students. But later you mentioned that there's an influence between teacher motivation and student self-esteem, or students also performance. So Patricia wants to know how is that this happens?
Yeah.
How is
So
that
which is
teacher motivation influences students' performance and self?
Yeah, so I mean, generally the research is tends to come down very, very definitively on teacher motivation and student achievement. So the slide that I showed you, I wanted to, that may have confused things, but I wanted to throw it in there because this is UNESCO's data from Latin America, and it's, let me go back to it for a second, because it's important. So teacher satisfaction, which intuitively you would imagine influences student performance, has been shown in the Latin American context, actually, to not always consistently influence student achievement. So, but generally, if you look at the research, the research is very clear. The teachers who are motivated get the best out of their students. So a lot of this is just intuitive. We know this from, this makes sense. But specifically for a number of the reasons that I mentioned. So teachers who have high degrees of motivation, and this does include satisfaction, they want to get better at their craft. And that's critically important. So they're constantly trying to learn, they're applying what they've learned, they have sort of an achievement orientation to do well. But they also have high expectations for their students. So they communicate these high expectations to students, and they convince students that they can do well. So they really encourage student self-efficacy, this belief by students that I can actually do this. Teachers who are highly motivated, who often seek out and participate in professional development experiences, also then have a greater sense of, they have more tools in their toolbox in order to be good instructors. So they know certain strategies. They may know their content well. They may know pedagogical content. They may have techniques for pedagogical content knowledge. They may understand assessment better. They may have better communication strategies. They may care more about students. And all of this translates into better achievement for students. So it's almost a virtuous circle. So teachers who are motivated, who have very strong goal orientations, who have very high degrees of expectancy, will actually participate in and create opportunities for themselves to increase their own skill set. So it's almost the opposite of that funnel that I showed you. And this then, of course, translates into achievement for students, greater achievement for students. Did that answer the question?
Yes, Mary, thank you so much. I want to continue with these other two questions that I think are related to each other.
Okay.
One is asked by Saira Ponte. She says that could social conditions affect directly the motivation of students and thus have a certain impact in the motivation of teachers? And I think we can relate this also to her later question that says, does the results of PISA exams be related to the demotivation in education?
I'm not sure. So let me go to the first one, because yes. So the answer is yes. There is research showing that, again, any of us who've been teachers, I taught in very poor schools for probably 9 of my 10 years teaching. Kids who are at risk, who come from poor families, who come from families where they're, and maybe abuse. Abuse occurs across socioeconomic levels, but kids who have problems at home, kids who have come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, kids who are at risk, kids who, there's just come from, challenging social conditions. They're often harder to teach for a variety of reasons. Some of it is discipline, especially with boys. Some of it is just not having supports, like not having a quiet place at home to do work, or electricity, or internet, or somebody who's going to make sure you do their work. Poor kids don't hear as much language at home as wealthy children do. Poor children don't get read to as much as rich kids, children from wealthy families do. So, poor kids come to school with a number of challenges, and that in turn challenges teachers. And kids who have poor children are much more likely often to have undiagnosed learning disabilities as opposed to wealthier kids. So all of that places a strain on teachers. And that's the demand side. And then from the supply side, if you're in an environment where you're not getting support, where you have tremendous accountability pressures, which so many teachers do now, and I think that gets to the second question that was asked, where you're not getting the professional development, or you don't have the school-based support system to work with these children and help them do well and succeed and overcome some of their challenges, then it's extraordinarily demotivating. And the research is pretty clear on that, at least from the United States. Teachers in wealthy school districts where kids do really well and go off to Harvard and Yale, they tend to stay teaching. And teachers in poor school districts with a much more challenging populations where students struggle tend to leave. And I was one of those teachers. So in terms of the PISA, that's an interesting question, and I don't have an answer to that. I wouldn't know enough to begin to answer that question. I will say that where in places that I've been where PISA scores are high, like Hong Kong and Singapore, where I've spent a fair amount of time, those high scores are tremendously motivating. Teachers take great pride in those. But I will say that I work with teachers a lot. The whole pressure of accountability that teachers are feeling everywhere is tremendously demotivating. So a lot of teachers talk to me about just the pressure of the testing system here in the United States, or new curriculum that they consider to be much more difficult and rigorous and challenging for students. So that kind of accountability pressure, especially under No Child Left Behind here in the United States, is tremendously demotivating, and we know that people have left teaching because of it. And we know that people won't go back into teaching because of it. So I'll just use myself as an example. I would love to teach again, but not in this current climate in the United States where there's so much accountability and there's so much testing. It sort of saps the joy out of being a teacher, because one of the great things about being a teacher is the tremendous amount of creativity that you can have.
Thank you, Mary. Well, I think we have run out of questions at this point, and also I think we have reached the time to finish our webinar. Okay. But before we say goodbye and we close this session, I also wanted to ask you about teacher motivation and its relation to different groups of teachers, particularly in a region in the Americas, knowing that we have different cultural groups. We have indigenous people, we have Afro-descendants, and of course this is related also with different dialects, different languages. So do you think, from your experience working in the Americas, do you think there's also a connection between what motivates an indigenous teacher and what motivates a teacher in rural or urban areas?
I mean, there is research showing, I haven't looked at indigenous versus non-indigenous populations, but I've looked at research that looks at motivation in rural versus urban areas. So oftentimes, so China's a great example of this. So they've done questionnaires and studies in China and find that there's much higher levels of teacher satisfaction teaching in urban areas than there are in rural areas. So yeah, I think, and that gets back to issues about maybe resources and having colleagues and having kind of supports. In an urban area, presumably you have more of everything because there are more people. So you have potentially more, you have better, typically you have better access to you have access to better infrastructure, you have access to better resources, and more resources, you have access to more colleagues. So there is definitely globally an urban-rural divide in terms of teacher motivation. It's not uniform, but it does exist.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
I also wanted to add that Andrea Naleto has shared with us important text that might be of interest of the teachers and policymakers that attended today's webinar.
Yep.
There it's on the chat. It's a World Bank study, Learning in the Face of Adversity, the UNRWA education program for Palestine refugees. Thank you, Andrea, for sharing this.
Thank you, Andrea.
And just once again, so I want to let you know that to access the materials used during this webinar and to keep learning about this topic with your peers, please go visit the Inter-American Collaboratory on the Teaching Profession at the link that you see there. And we'll be uploading the video recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel at Riediten. Mary, thank you so much once again for accepting this invitation. And this is the first webinar of this webinar series, and I can say that it has been a success, and I hope that our policymakers in the Americas and our teachers keep enjoying and also nurturing from this important insights.
Great, thank you, everybody. And if anyone, I didn't include resources, excuse me, references, but if you need references, please feel free to email me and I can send you the list of references that I used. So thanks all.
Thank you so much. So we finish our session here, and we'll see you next month in November with other 2 webinars on teaching policy and teacher profession. Thank you. Bye, Mary.
Bye.